Hi, everyone. Welcome to our July webinar. We have quite a bit to cover today, so I'll jump right in just a few moments. The topic for this month's webinar is related to mold remediation, how to handle situations where you may find mold or moisture in your client's home, and how to be a good asset to them, and just understanding a little bit about the basics of remediation. Like I said, there's quite a few topics we're going to cover today, so we're going to jump in here pretty quick. If you have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can as we go along in the webinar, and then there will be some time for questions at the end. Depending how fast we get through the content, we'll determine how many questions we get to. We try to keep these as close to half hour as we can. I know everyone is busy. We do record these, so if you have to drop off early and you don't get to watch the entire presentation, you'll find these on our website and in an email, typically tomorrow, the day after the webinar. So go ahead and get started. The agenda, we're going to just do a quick intro. If you've watched our webinars before, it's the same intro you're used to. And then we're going to dig into the content, starting with what do you do if you find mold, alternatives, as well as what not to say or do. It's good to know what you should do, but there's also a few key things that you shouldn't do as a home inspector or consultant, and then how to take your expertise to the next level related to mold, how to share results, how to answer some questions your clients might have, and then Q&A at the end. So my name is Dylan. I'm Director of Operations here at Sporecyte, certified industrial hygienist. I've done hundreds of mold inspections in residential, commercial, and in industrial properties, as well as other air quality assessments, other industrial hygiene work as well. Our company is TechSite. Our product is Sporecyte. Our company was founded in 2013. We're world leaders in machine learning and artificial intelligence, specifically around digital microscopy. We focus on air, liquid, and smearable diagnostic testing. We're used by labs, pathologists, other kinds of doctors, veterinaries, home and building inspectors, environmental consultants across all of our product lines. So we have three verticals or brands inside of our company. There's Sporecyte, which is our environmental analysis. We do human analysis for human medical laboratories, hospitals, clinics, under our company name of TechSite. We have a very important collaboration with Mayo Clinic. Our animal diagnosis is offered exclusively through Zoetis as a vet scan imagist, where we handle a whole number of veterinary diagnostic tests. So our lab is a AIHA MPAT participant. We're licensed by the state of Texas. It's the only state that requires a license at this time. So it's the only specific state license that we have. We're also ISO 17025 accredited. Our standard operating procedure for our lab is $20 a sample, same day turnaround time, with optional overnight shipping available. We try to keep those things very simple so you can be a very predictable experience with our lab. So with that, we're going to jump right into the topic. We'll start with the first topic here. What happens after mold is found? So we're going to assume you found mold in a client's home, either via air testing, surface testing, visual observations. So remediation, maybe let's start by just defining what remediation is. That is the act of restoring or removing mold and damaged building materials from an environment and returning it to a pre-loss state. So meaning that the mold has all been either cleaned or removed, depending on the types of materials, and what remains is completely free of that external biological growth. So Remediation in a home is important because mold can cause health effects in sensitive individuals, things such as allergies, asthma, respiratory issues. People are very young, very old, immunocompromised, or people with specific mold allergies or sensitivities can be affected more severely. It poses a structural issue to the building materials in the home. Mold requires moisture to grow. So underneath any mold problem is a moisture problem. And most building materials, a key problem is too much moisture can cause those materials to fail. The mold or fungal growth itself can feed on the materials like wood and drywall, causing rot and structural damage. So can the unresolved moisture issues. And then also there's an effect on real estate values. Mold and moisture will hurt a property's value. If you have a wet, moldy home, it's clearly not going to go for as much as a home, comparable home that is free of those issues. Causes delays in closing due to additional inspections or remediation or other things that have to happen or choose to happen. And in many states, you have to disclose those things on future sales. Not every state, but many states do require that. So you're not just kind of there to give someone a yes or no mold. There is mold, there isn't mold. It's really helpful if you can at least answer some basic questions to them as to why they should be taking action if mold is found. So generally speaking, there's a few main steps in the remediation process. One is source identification and moisture control. So source being what is causing, what is allowing for that mold to grow on these materials. Was it a foundation leak or a plumbing leak or a roofing problem that's caused for this excess moisture to collect on these materials that's allowing for mold to grow? Because mold is so critical, or moisture is so critical in mold problems, identifying what's causing those things is the most critical thing in remediation, because if you don't resolve the underlying source issues, you can remediate the mold, but it can come back if those underlying moisture issues haven't been resolved. The next step is containment. Typically in remediation, there is some amount of containment that is set up to minimize cross-contamination because the act of cleaning and removing building materials is inherently disruptive. You have to cut and remove drywall out, creates a lot of dust, a lot of debris can become airborne. So can those mold spores on that material. And you don't want to spread it to other areas of the home, causing then the remediation to have to cover surfaces in the air and other sides of the home. The next step is surface cleaning via HEPA vacuums or air cleaning or air cleaning using HEPA air scrubbers. You may also consider dehumidification as well, removing excess moisture from the air. The next step is like the actual, now we're at step 4, that's the actual remediation step. That's the removal or restoration of damaged materials, depending on the materials present and their porosity. Porous in some semi-porous materials, porous being like drywall, paper, cardboard, fabric, semi-porous being things like wood. Many of those things will be removed and replaced. Some semi-porous, like structural lumber, for the most part, with mold issues, that's the mold's removed from the surface with sanding, wire brushing, media blasting, those types of things. Things like tile or glass or plastics, non-porous, and those are typically cleaned and restored and not removed and replaced. So depends on the actual materials that are impacted. And then the final step being post-remediation testing, making sure that the remediation has been done completely. There's no residual mold or moisture in the materials and remaining materials that are left in place, and making sure that there's no external effect to the air in the unrelated areas. So typically post-remediation verification testing relies on very detailed visual inspection of the work area and adjacent areas, sampling of some sort, And then after, and this should be happening prior to building the area back. So it should be a while the area has been opened up, materials have been removed, but not replaced yet. Got a couple questions here that I can ask. I think of mold as often being in a wet environment, so I wonder how well vacuuming will work. So if we come back to the steps here of the remediation process, step one being source identification and moisture control. If you're in a basement that's flooded, right, and there's 2 inches of liquid water in the basement, the immediate need is getting that water out of the environment. You know, we're pumping that water out, drying the space is critical in that time. So that's far before this step number 3, where vacuuming comes into place. Typically, when you're doing vacuuming of surfaces, so imagine in this office that I'm working in, we find mold on this, maybe this wall leaked, is external wall, and maybe the masonry on the external wall has been compromised and moisture was brought in during a rainstorm, and this drywall has been affected. You would remove and replace the drywall here, but things like this desk I'm sitting at may have a buildup of settled mold spores or dust from removing the debris, removing the drywall from the wall. Those are the things that would be HEPA vacuumed. A lot of the times it's done, you HEPA vac and clean prior to a demolition, and then you do it afterwards as well. That's a common step. So typically when you're vacuuming, things are dry, and there are wet dry HEPA vacuums out there in the market too. So you could vacuum materials that are wet as well with HEPA filtration. So timeline and cost range, this is really variable depending on the specific project, but a professional remediation project will take 1 to 5 days or more if it's a large scale complex issue. Costs can be anywhere from 500 to over 10,000 depending on the scale. And that's going to depend on a lot of factors, such as the size of the area that needs to be remediated, what kinds of materials need to be remediated, the source of the moisture issues, accessibility, resolving remediation issues in a very hard to reach area is going to take more time and effort than somewhere that's very easily accessible. And like I said, the types of materials affected will also impact the cost, and so can other things such as local factors, you know, where you're located, your specific market, you know, how many contractors are available, how busy it is. All those other factors can all play a role in cost. But generally speaking, these types of projects are not very cheap. So it's you know, what should your clients expect from a professional remediator? Depending on your state, this industry may or may not be regulated by the state. You may be required to have licensing for a remediation company. You may not. Most states don't require or don't have a process for regulation, but some do. But generally speaking, professional remediator should, prior to conducting any work, have a clear remediation protocol or plan where they talk about the specifics of what needs to be done for containment, removal, and cleanup. These people should be using proper PPE, safety gear. They should be using things like HEPA filtration, air scrubbers, HEPA vacuums, dehumidifiers in some cases. And they should also not just be there to treat the mold, but they should be there to help. And they might not be the one to fix the underlying moisture problem. Most of the times they won't be, but part of their work can be help finding the source and helping to refer you to the right person to fix the problem that's underlying the underlying moisture problem. And then a final test, and typically it's best to have the final clearance test be done by an independent party away from the remediation company. There's a lot of ability to have bias if you're the one doing the work and then grading the work at the end of it. So it's best typically to avoid any conflict of interest and have a third party do a final clearance test. And you could be that third party, that independent third party. I have a question here. Can you speak to the efficacy of dry fogging as a means to getting rid of mold? I can't, with any amount of authority, I can say I haven't seen any professional guidance document, which we'll talk about in a little bit, reference dry fogging as an effective method. Generally speaking, remediation should be the removal of mold from the environment and not just the killing or treatment of mold that's left in place. So dry fogging may be able to be an antimicrobial. It may kill the mold spores or microbes that are present, but it won't make it disappear. It's not magic. It won't eliminate it from the environment, typically speaking. So I haven't done and I haven't seen any specific studies with hard science about the efficacy of those products, but generally speaking, documents like IICRC S520 and similar industry documents, that sort of treatment isn't a part of those types of guidelines. So if a source, and then another question, if source of moisture is removed or resolved, will the mold go dormant? If the mold is not growing, can it be left in place as it will not be actively adding spores to the air? Mold that's not actively wet can stop reproducing, but what that doesn't mean is it doesn't remove that mold from the environment. Those spores that are on the surface here may be still releasing slowly into the air for a significant amount of time. On a few square inches of mold growth, you could have millions of spores. And if those spores aren't removed from the environment, they can still cause health effects and other issues as well, even if they're not currently reproducing. Even non-viable or dead mold can cause those allergic and other reactions in individuals. So it's best, and that's why all professional reference materials to mold remediation consider remediation being the removal of mold from the environment, not just the killing or deactivating of mold. So we're going to talk about, and this is kind of a good segue into this next topic of cleaning alternatives and when they may be appropriate, because not just because you found some mold in a home doesn't necessarily mean a professional company needs to be retained and contracted to do mold removal. So generally speaking, the EPA and other organizations have a suggestion of things less than 10 square feet can typically be cleaned from just with general methods. They have assumed or predict that level of growth is small enough that a general handyman or homeowner can tackle that with the correct methods, and we'll talk about that here. So less than 10 square feet, so, 3 foot by 3 foot, or 1 foot by 10 foot type area of mold growth. Again, PPE is going to be important to protect the person performing the cleaning. Knowing about the porosity of a material, non-porous materials or some semi-porous materials can be cleaned effectively using typical cleaning methods. The materials aren't structurally damaged by the water. Your drywall isn't crumbling or cracking away. The structural lumber hasn't rotted away. There's not really health complaints by the occupants, and the moisture issue has been resolved. Some moisture issues, like for example, maybe the drain on the washing machine wasn't plumbed up correctly and it spilled all over a wall, and they ran a couple cycles before noticing. That was an acute water issue that can be resolved quickly, just by hooking the hose up the right way and putting it into the sink or the drain, and that moisture issue is not going to come back. That's a good example of a situation where the moisture source has been identified and resolved. So how would someone clean these surfaces? So a typical just general cleaning solution can be worked. My recommendation is typically just dish detergent and water. Other people use things like vinegar, hydrogen peroxide. You don't need to use antimicrobials or bleach or anything that harsh. Just a general dish detergent and water or vinegar, hydrogen peroxide. Those sorts of things can be done to clean the surface. And cleaning would be, spraying and removing, wiping the surface clean, not just spraying it and leaving it in place. It's the actual cleaning step that is key there. So again, these solutions are good for small localized spots, but this isn't going to address the underlying cause of the mold, the moisture problems. And also incomplete cleaning or incomplete resolution of moisture problems can be not sufficient enough, and these things can come back if not properly resolved. It can also cause cross-contamination from one area to the next if you're not using proper methods. So the standard, the gold standard in the industry, this is just one of many, but if you talk to professional remediation companies, most of them will be following IICRC S520 and R520. These are supplemental documents that go together. And they list out the 5 steps to address the mold: is to identify that there is mold problem, determine the extent of the growth, contain the area, remove or clean the materials, and verify that the cleanup has worked. We do have a blog on this topic as well. It's very similar content as you'll see here, but you can check out the blog on our website too. These documents can be found online through IICRC's website. It's an important standard. If you're going to be doing a lot of mold work, this is something that I would really recommend. Even if you're not doing remediation work, this is something I would recommend reading and understanding the methods that remediation companies would be doing. So when would you recommend a professional? If it's larger than 10 square feet, that's where it's time to call a professional. And in some regulated states, there are carve-outs for homeowners or handyman or general contractors where they can only clean up to a certain amount. There's typically carve-outs for homeowners in general that they're able to do whatever they want, but general contractors or handymen are limited based on the size of the mold growth in those regulated states. The location, if it's in a hard to reach area, HVAC system, crawl spaces, attics, inside of walls, or in areas that are particularly sensitive and hard to contain, it's probably when you want to call a professional. And if anyone in the home has issues related to mold, then it's probably best to leave it to the professional so you don't potentially make the issue in the air and environment worse. So I've got a question that says, I have significant mold in an remote area of the home, and testing in adjacent areas is within acceptable range. How much cleaning should be done in the areas outside of the sphere of growth, and how far away from the source? So typically, if the adjacent areas are testing normal, you wouldn't need to clean those areas just because there's no evidence that there's been contamination outside of the immediate area. So this would be a situation where containment would be set up in that localized area. Work would be done to clean or remove the mold from the environment. And then in post-testing, prior to build back and prior to taking down the containment, you would want to test the containment area as well as the adjacent areas to make sure no cross-contamination happened. I've seen cross-contamination issues where prior to the remediation, there was no effect, no detectable levels of elevated mold in adjacent areas, but the containment wasn't successful, or the methods used, moving materials in and out of containment, the containment wasn't maintained very well, and they actually created a cross-contamination issue during and after remediation. So that's why it's important to test adjacent areas as well to make sure that cross-contamination hasn't been affected. So I wouldn't think you need to clean any of those non-affected areas prior to the remediation, but if there is post-testing that shows cross-contamination, then things like HEPA vacuuming, wiping of surfaces, detailed cleaning in those areas should be done. So what not to say or do. This is an important one because a lot of the people on this call are home inspectors or generalists, right? You're not experts in everything mold. So you want to make sure that your language and how you communicate to your clients is very matter of fact and sticks to some key points. So it's important to make them understand you're not assessing if a home or area is safe or unsafe or healthy or unhealthy. We're looking to see if there's an impact in the air quality, if there's elevated levels of mold in the air, or if there's visible impacts or identified impacts on building materials. You probably don't want to specifically recommend specific remediation companies saying you've got to use this one guy. You might want to have a short list of people they can reach out to, but demanding that they use one company over the others is typically, unless you're in a specific situation where you've got two remediation companies in your town and one is bad and one is good, you can explain it to them in that way. And then the last thing is understand we're not interpreting health risks unless you're a doctor. I'm sure there's at least one doctor that got out of the medical industry and started a home inspection company, but most of us aren't healthcare professionals, so we can't associate the results from mold testing to specific health risks or health symptoms and things like that. So if you're really interested in mold testing and you want to know more, if you're maybe interested in offering remediation yourself, there's a number of things you can do. So certifications, if you really want to do mold inspections and testing to the next level, consider certifications such as the ACAC, Certified Microbial Investigator, Certified Microbial Consultant, the CIE or the CRIE, CMI, CMC. Those are all reputable certifications that will really designate that you have been assessed on your knowledge and skills. There's IICRC, which has remediation related and restoration related certification, such as the AMRT. There's formal training courses for these. There's self-guided study guides available as well. Generally, there's a cost associated with getting training and achieving the certification. And some states will require either certification or licensing. So it's important to know with your local state or the states that you work in what their requirements are, so you can make sure that you are meeting those requirements prior to carrying out any of the work. So I'll cover these topics really fast. We're running short on time. We've got a lot of we've got webinars specifically on this topic as well that you can check out, as well as some blog and other resources on our website. So our reports are pretty easy to read, but interpreting the report to your client is key. So it'll show you both what specific mold spores were identified and how many of those spores were identified in the actual table of the report. When we find an elevated or potentially elevated level, there's a summary graph on the at a glance page, which is at the very front of the report, and you get this green, yellow, or red indication telling you how elevated it is. So slight versus major, this is really the one we get the most questions about. Our reports offer some generally broad initial guidance. We only look at these numbers. We don't have all the details and context that an inspector would have. So we're not able to be very specific when we only have this context. So oftentimes it could be something that's just slightly elevated, that there's not really a mold issue. There's some other things happening that allow for it. And other times a slight is a clue that there may be hidden or unseen mold growth. So a slight is a key point where you can recommend to your client to conduct a further inspection with a more specific, more specialized environmental consultant who can dig into that next level that you're not quite able to do as a general home inspector. And a major reading is pretty clear that there is some sort of underlying mold or moisture problem going on in that area that should be resolved, which again is another trigger for you to recommend them interface with a specific mold expert. The numbers on these reports can be very confusing to some people. So they all get counted in a unit called spores per cubic meter, so they can be compared to each other between samples and to the outdoor reference sample. So there's numbers for the individual spore classes, the individual particulate classes, and total counts as well. And issues can be detected on a class level or a total level of if the sum of all the mold there is significantly different than the reference samples, it may also trigger an elevated result. So answering questions to your clients, you want to stick to some key talking points unless you have specific training or knowledge that's relevant to mold. So general statements like saying mold was detected, which usually points to an underlying moisture issue. The next step is identifying and fixing what moisture issue was present to prevent regrowth. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a health hazard or not. It's hard, as a home inspector, I'm not able to say on that topic, but it does suggest that you should consider a follow-up with a specific mold professional. You want to make sure that the client's expectations are set correctly. Talking through that mold issues, generally speaking, can be resolved fairly easily if they're caught early. If the moisture issue is a minor one before it becomes a major moisture issue, it's usually the smaller the project, the smaller the underlying problem, the easier it is to resolve. And it is important. The most important thing with the mold problem is the underlying moisture issue, because that will prevent it from coming back. And then also just making sure you're clear with kind of the scope of your work. As a home inspector, you're a generalist. You're looking at a lot of different systems, but you're not looking at health risks, and you're not a remediation expert. But you can be a reference to help give them the data to point them in the right direction. You can also help them find a certified mold remediator in your area. Building up a list of referral sources. Like I said earlier, it may contradict that a bit. You don't want to steer them only to one specific company. You want to provide them with a reputable list, and that they can make their determination of which company is best for their situation. So we've got a lot of topics. We talked about this topic quite a bit, so you can check out these other webinars from previous times. So here's just a select few that may be relevant if you have more questions or want to know more about remediation and mold in your client's home. We also have a number of blogs, marketing kits, and resources on our website for both inspectors and homeowners. So Q&A, I'll keep a few minutes here for some questions and answers. We're a couple minutes over, so if you've got to jump off, you can come back and watch the recording, and these Q&As will be up on the recording. I do have a question here that says, I've been brought into a post-remediation process and slight presence is found. Would you say this needs attention, or the presence in the process of being removed? So you shouldn't, if there is a slight or major elevation in a post-remediation step, that to me would mean that remediation is not complete, and you shouldn't sign off on it until it has been completed completely. So a presence of a slight level would mean maybe air scrubbing needs to happen longer, maybe additional cleaning needs to happen. If you didn't find any visual or residual growth, that's a key thing. But you want to make sure that the air has also been returned back to a pre-lot state, which would to me mean no indication of of a presence of water damage indicators, and the levels are removed or back to a at or below background state. So I would say that I would say in that situation, I wouldn't write my report up as that result as being a cleared remediation, and depending on the situation, give them feedback as to if additional air cleaning or surface cleaning should be done, and in retesting prior to removing containment and build back. I still hear some confusion from clients about mold versus mildew versus moss. Is there a webinar that distinguishes these in details? There is a webinar that talks about this specific question. It's actually in a couple of webinars, of which I don't remember exactly which ones, but I can cover that pretty quickly right now. It's growing in a home on building materials. It's not mildew and it's not going to be moss. Maybe on the exterior of the home, it could be moss, but on the interior of the home, it's not going to be moss and it's not going to be mildew. It's going to be mold or some other fungal growth like that. Mildew is a specific, scientifically speaking, mildew is a plant parasite. It will only grow on plants. So the only place you may have mildew growing inside of a home is on a sick house plant, not on a shower wall or a shower curtain or other surfaces. Mildew has kind of been the term used by realtors, property managers, landlords, etc., trying to downplay mold, trying a more benign term most often. Now, a lot of times I'll hear it, specifically in bathrooms, around grout lines, or dark discolored caulking, or like I said, on shower curtains. They'll say, "Oh, that's not mold, that's just mildew." It actually probably is a type of mold, but it's related to those environments being dirty, which goes back to the cleaning side of things. Typically, those can be cleaned up and doesn't need a professional remediation. But if it's growing in a home on building materials, it's not mildew and it's not moss, scientifically speaking. Moss, you see it on siding and exterior building materials sometimes. If you see it indoors, it's in a property that's been impacted by the elements for a long time, and there's bigger problems there. I've got a question here. I don't know if I'll be able to answer this question reliably, but can you speak about mycotoxins and its effects on people with mold allergies? I heard about 24% of people have allergic reactions to mycotoxins. So an allergic reaction to mycotoxins is probably not the correct term. A mycotoxin is a chemical that's produced by the microbes during their just normal growth process. And those toxins have, depending on the type of toxin they are, have different impacts on humans and animals and other living organisms. And that reaction isn't typically an allergic reaction. Typically, these are other types of immune reactions. So when we talk about allergies, we're talking about it's typically a reaction, an overreaction by the body to specific proteins on the surface of mold that creates a histamine response. And mycotoxins aren't typically going to be producing a similar response. Mycotoxins will probably affect 100% of people with the right concentration. It may be that in the reference you're talking about 24% of people have a sensitivity to mycotoxins, and maybe they're saying those amount of people have a higher reaction to those toxins. It's really hard to say specifically because in the built environment, there's a dozen or so different mycotoxins that could be produced, and the dose, the amount of that you're exposed to is really the key to how a human reacts, and there's a lot of variables to say. So I unfortunately don't have any specific mycotoxin information prepared beyond those little tidbits, but maybe that'll help you on your search for more information on mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are much harder to test for than the actual biological structures, the spores and hyphae that our test looks for. It requires typically pretty expensive and advanced chemical-based assays to be done to identify environmental mycotoxins. So there are some labs that offer that, ours do not. So that's the last question. I'm going to wrap things up. Again, thanks for joining us. We'll have another webinar next month. And yeah, there's a whole bunch. This is our 20th webinar, so we have 27 more on our website and a number of blogs to keep expanding your knowledge base. And we hope to see you on the next one. So thank you. Have a good evening.